All right, so I wanted to go over the microaggression email from the church that came out yesterday. I've had a lot of feedback on this. I've had a lot of people email me, what's going on? Is this what we're going to expect in the future? Let me just kind of go over what this is for those of you that don't know. There is an email that goes out. You can go onto the list from the church that gives you a number of different messages, a lot of them positive, almost all of them positive, and they have certain themes to them sometimes. The theme of this one is called Be Inclusive, Not Just Accepting. And in this email, they usually give several different links to talks or videos or, a lot of from the general authorities or Liahona articles and things like that. Well, one of them is a Liahona article that you link to that the title of this, which is unfortunate, but the title of it is Jesus Christ Knows Our Pain, Navigating Discrimination, Exclusion, and Microaggressions. Now, before I get into that article and talk a little bit more about the appearance of microaggressions in the church, on the church website, right, in the Liahona magazine, I want to talk a little bit more about the overall message itself, because again, I think it's really important that we that we use, again, President Oak's clear thinking. We have to parse this out and see what's going on. I've had people that have reacted to this that have said, I've taken my name off of the email list because they've had too many of these types of microaggressions ending up in their inbox. And from the language and from maybe some of the topics. And, I think we just need to really think clearly on this. Look, let's take a look here. If you're on the video, we'll take a look at what this is here. So here's the picture at the top of the email. The top overall message of this is be inclusive, not just accepting. And I'm going to read this as the message that is sent in the email. It says, becoming a disciple of Christ includes accepting and including all, even and maybe especially when they are different from you. Great message. We need this. Elder Dale G. Renland taught, we value the kaleidoscope of others' characteristics, perspectives, and talents. We can bring our heritage, culture, and experiences to the Church of Jesus Christ. This is from General Conference, this past one in October 2021. So that's the overall message of this. And so all of the links that go along with this are under that message of be inclusive, not just accepting. It's a good message. And as we are a church that is growing globally and we're bringing in a number of different people, that's a very important thing to look at, right? But there are two approaches to this, I think, that we oftentimes need to look at in something like this. And one is that, okay, globally, this is important. We have a lot of different peoples that are joining. The church is growing greatly in Latin America, of course, the Philippines, Africa, and these are places that we need to, it's nice to learn more about them and try to be inclusive as much as we can in a global environment, online, and the message of the church needs to be inclusive. And the other is what is the messaging from the church, and who are those in those departments that, for example, put the email list together and put out some of these words and some of these messages. I think there's a strong distinction. We have to look at this. There is a strong distinction from what you hear at General Conference and what you might get in an email from the church. Again, I bring this up because there's been so much feedback on this. People are freaked out about microaggressions showing up in their daily email from the church. So I that's what we're talking about. That's what we're going to go over. I want to go over a few of the links here real quick that they bring up that I think are good. One is called We All Belong. And the subtitle to that is Watch Uplifting Messages from Church Leaders on Belonging and Feeling the Savior's Love. I've gone through this. I've seen a number of these. It's mostly the apostles, First Presidency, that are, it's a link to a series that is put up on YouTube. and it's very good. It's excellent. But I want to keep in mind, I would like us all to keep in mind the term belong and belonging. I think the church is kind of settled in, I'm guessing, on the messaging of that word. They want to use that word. And you can look at the experience we had through BYU, right? This whole last year where you had this committee that was put together called, I think it's Race, Equity, and Belonging. Most of those departments at universities today are called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And the church, that's closer to what that committee wanted the name to be of that department at BYU. BYU said no, and probably rather the Brethren said no. And what they're doing with is they're going with an office of belonging. So it's probably a better word to use, I think. I think it distinguishes yourself a little bit from the rest of the universities and kind of what they're moving toward with this academic religion of critical social justice that is happening out there. I think that's important. Now, just so you know, the word belonging is going to be a little bit tricky still. It's still the better way to go, I think, my opinion. But it's still a little bit tricky because belonging is also something that is appropriated by critical social justice authors and pundits. They use this a lot. Willie Jennings, for example, uses the term belonging a lot, but uses it more in a similar way that it's used for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's going to be a little bit tricky, but it is still a better approach. Look for this word to come out more and more and more from the church, and for them to fill in the foundation of this word, the definition, the boundaries of this word. And I think they will. And it's, again, this is just my speculation here, but I think they're going to do that and try and use it as a rallying point of gathering Israel in a way, in a sense, right? So look for the word belong and belonging and how the church uses that. That is going to be important. Now, a couple more here before I get to the article of microaggressions here. We have a culture of inclusion is another one. Here are steps you can take to better include others in a church setting. This is great. This is what we do in ward council, right? Is looking at how do we help those that, as the term is being used more and more, are marginalized, right? That may not feel included. They may not feel like they belong. They don't have all of the standard Latter-day Saint, the family, the spouse. They don't maybe look like everybody else. They may have a little bit of a different background, a number of different things, right? So that's an important thing to do, and that should be discussed oftentimes in ward council. That's one of the primary purposes of ward council, is to look for those people in the ward. And then lastly, we are all God's children. President Russell M. Nelson invites us to abandon attitudes of prejudice. Now, this is the key to all of this identity stuff, this identitarianism. And I think the church is taking a very good approach on this. This is not going to be black and white, though. This is not going to be black and white for the church to be able to navigate through this. They are putting the identity of each of us as children of God, sons and daughters of God, as our primary identity. So as the rest of the United States, and eventually now this is going to move out into the world as well, but mostly in the United States right now, where we're the religion of academia is trying to make us focus more and more on identities of race and of ethnicity, of sexual orientation, of ableism, and every other thing you can think of, because it's going to the intersectional ladder is going to fill in more and more and more with more and more advanced social science and theory disciplines at universities. It's going to explode in all these number of different identities and work, academic work that's going to be done. It's going to become very it's a perfect laboratory to recreate Pharisaicalism. That's what it is moving toward. And a breakdown in our social structure, a breakdown of interactions between one and another other than those that are measured by power and distinction. Ites. That's what this will do. But President Nelson, in his piece here on We Are All Children of God, you see this is from May of 2021. He says here, let us be clear. We are brothers and sisters, each of us the child of a loving Father in heaven. His Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, invites all to come unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female. That's from 2 Nephi. It behooves each of us to do whatever we can in our spheres of influence to preserve the dignity and respect of every son and daughter of God deserves. Okay, so that is to be key for the church, I believe. And that is part of this overall message here. So keep that in mind as we're going through trying to look at clear thinking here with the microaggression mention here in the church email. All right, then lastly, we get to the article that mentions microaggressions. So I want to just show you what it is and what I think is going to start happening with the church in some of this terminology here. First of all, I ran a search on the church website. You can see here in searching for microaggression, there was one thing that came up, one thing. And that is this article that is linked in the email. So this is the first introduction of the word microaggression onto the LDS.org or the on the church's website, the churchofjesuschrist.org website. And I'm guessing that there are going to be many, many more that are going to be brought in. And you would say, well, why are they going to do that, Greg? Why would they be adding in terms like microaggressions? Something that is kind of cringy, right? It's kind of cringy. And I understand that it is cringy. What is happening on the universities and campuses across the country right now with the term microaggression and how that's turning things around, where you basically have these kids that can't handle anything, is disturbing and is really highlighted really well in Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. So let me go to the article real quick. I'm just briefly going to go to this, and then I want to talk about this language and this word just a little bit more. First of all, Jesus Christ knows the pain we feel from prejudice. Okay. My quest is to see people as the Savior would see them. This is all good. This is written by a South African sister. By the way, we have a fairly large following in South Africa on this podcast. And I've got a communication with several South Africans. And, they're in a little bit of a different situation than we are in the United States. But race is still an issue, obviously, in South Africa. And so there are some similarities. There's much, 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 much more segregation in South Africa than there is in the United States. And what's happening in the U.S. is much more about agitating what we have, right? The segregation that we have, the tiny bit of segregation that we have. The improvement over racism that we have is being held back in a way by agitators who want to do what is called, again, a term you should know, consciousness raising on this issue. They are agitating. They're putting salt into scratches to try and make this painful as possible. But here's what this good sister says in her article. She says, as a black Mozambican Latter-day Saint woman living in South Africa for the past 18 years, I navigate discrimination and exclusion, often displayed as microaggression. I'm going to get back to that. And then she kind of goes on to the list, right, of intersectionality here a little bit. So she goes into racism, classism, tribalism, sexism, and xenophobia are a few examples of the ills of segregation that society still faces. So these are things that she experiences. They are real. Now, a lot of people aren't going to like to see those words because the reaction to someone in the United States that has seen the growth of these words being used is exactly in the framework that I said, and it is to agitate. Right? It is to create agitation. It is to pour salt on the wounds. And to find categories of people, to put them into collective groups, into an intersectional ladder. And so this is a little bit more, a lot of people are going to have a difficult time reading this. Now, if you read the whole article, you'll see how wonderful this woman is. She's a wonderful mother, and she does experience these things, especially, it's very different in South Africa than it is in the United States. Not that individuals don't experience that in the U.S. either. They do. But there's this, again, clear thinking here. Sympathy for those that experience these things is important, while we have an understanding that these things are also being agitated and that we are being classified into different identities. So we can look at both of those things at the same time and use clear thinking to navigate ourselves through this. So back to the microaggression. And now she's obviously read a number of things where she's going to come up with these terms, right? What does she have? Microaggression, racism, classism, tribalism, sexism, and xenophobia. Okay, these are the classic words and classifications here. They're all real, right? They're all real. But she's either read a number of things or she's been in university and been taught all of these things and have had them heightened up somewhat, is my guess. Again, sounds like a wonderful woman, a wonderful mother. What I would love to do, she says she's been in South Africa for the past 18 years. I would love to know, I'd love to talk to her about why she went from Mozambique to South Africa and why she stayed there for 18 years if she's experiencing, her and her kids are experiencing all of these things. Maybe there is not a better alternative. I don't know. But I would be interested in finding that out, what the difference is between what she had in Mozambique and what she has in South Africa. Okay, on to microaggressions here. So as we see these types of words enter into church communication, and it's going to happen more and more, I think if you ran that search that I ran on the website for the church, 12 months from now, you're not going to find just one result. I think you're going to find several results when you type in microaggression. Now, why would that be? Well, I'd like you to think of a couple of different things here. Number one, the language and the religion of academia, and it is a religion, are what are creating ultimately down below the culture of the United States and beyond. And so as new words come out of academia and become, we used to think, well, Hollywood is the great, evil adversary of culture. It's not. It's education. It is education in our day and age. It's not Hollywood. Hollywood borrows from academia. Everything borrows from academia. And this isn't the first time in history that has happened. I mean, go back and look at the Great Apostasy and what was happening in Alexandria and all the doctors of religion, so to speak, that came out of Alexandria and into Christianity. What happened? Right? It's the same. You have two different religions, and you ended up with a kind of compromise between Alexandria and Jerusalem. Well, we're going to move more and more toward that. There's no way around it, right? And the church is going to obviously have to stand strong, but we are going to move toward that. It's hard to imagine that history is not going to repeat itself. That language and religion of critical social justice that is being spread out into the United States especially is what drives culture. And in my mind, it has just begun, and we're going to move much further into this area. So we're going to see language adopted in pop culture that is academic language. where we have generally seen in the past, in the 80s, you'd have the Valley Girl and kind of these surfer phrases and words that began to be used in pop culture nationally, and fashion and all sorts of things are influenced by some of these street movements, so to speak, right? And you have rap and hip hop and very, very popular today, and so the fashion and the music and the words around that are pretty strong. You have the influence of technology today that brings in new terminology and new words and a new culture, so to speak. And so our language adjusts a little bit and our culture adjusts a little bit. But I think down below all of that, most importantly to watch is what is coming out of academia and the culture that's coming out of there. Because that, to me, is what is going to dominate and swallow up all of these things. And so we're going to see these words a lot more even on the church website, because they're going to move into pop culture. They're going to move into our vocabulary, whether you like it or not. It's unfortunate in many ways. And you're going to see kind of this dialectical type of process where the language moves in, which you have to be very wary of, because everything that surrounds it is what is brought in with that language. All of its concepts, its ideas, its thought processes, they come in as a Trojan horse with the words. On the other side of that, what happens is when you move into pop culture with something, these words and these phrases, they get watered down somewhat. And they become a little bit of something just a little bit different. So you have your thesis, which would be, what's coming out of academia, the word that's coming out of academia. You have your antithesis, which is what happens when pop culture kind of gets a hold of it. And then you end up with something in the middle there, where everybody's a little bit confused as to what you're really meaning by the word. But let's look at the word microaggression here and why it's important. It is important. Language matters. Words matter, okay? Here's how it's described by Daryl Wing Su, who is a psychologist who popularized the term microaggressions. It's the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. Okay, we've gone well beyond that now in what microaggressions really mean. Now, today, this moves into mental health a lot. It moves into anything that kind of can trigger you or set you off. And we've heard the stories on campuses of students that hear something, even if it's adjacent to something that might be a concern for them. And all of a sudden, this microaggression, which was unintentional, is now more of an aggression. And that's something we need to understand and what is happening with these things. You don't end up with something just small as a microaggression. It becomes a larger and larger thing as the agitation continues, as the consciousness raising by the pundits of critical social justice continue to raise these concepts, then they become bigger and bigger. Now, with these words, something happens to them. It's not good enough to keep something that gains some momentum in its terminology. In other words, being popular, a popular word like microaggression. It can't stay as a micro level. It has to be bigger. It has to be more. And so here's what you get from the man who coined microaggression. He's a psychiatrist. His name is Chester M. Pierce. He says this: one must not look for the gross and obvious, right? The subtle, cumulative mini assault is the substance of today's racism. Okay, again, so microaggression originally was about race and mostly race and ethnicity, and then kind of spread out from there into the other intersectional groupings, and then into mental health, and then basically with the students on campuses to anything that triggers them at all. To a fragile mind, of course, there's an awful lot that can trigger you and become a microaggression. And what is scary is that the the microaggression is defined by the person who feels it, not by the person giving it. In its original form, a microaggression is something that is not intentional, but it doesn't matter. Many, many professors have been fired because of something very unintentional that a student brings up as a problem. And of course, the more fragile our kids are, the young generation is, the more microaggressions there are going to be. Now, Dr. Sue, who I quoted previously and who popularized the term microaggression, says this about it. I was concerned that people who use these examples would take them out of context and use them as a punitive rather than an exemplary way. Well, that's exactly what is happening here. That's exactly what is happening with microaggressions. And so when you see the term microaggression show up in a church communication, the problem is that everything that surrounds that, everything in our culture that surrounds the idea of a microaggression is a part of that word. And then you say, well, why is the church using that word? Again, we've gone over that a little bit already about language and culture. But to someone who's writing in and talking about microaggression, something that they experience, which is very real, right? And then to communicate that to everybody else, to the rest of the church, especially in the United States, that can be a little bit tricky. Again, as far as these words growing into something much bigger and becoming everything, you get the idea of words are violence, right? So now it's not, okay, violence may not be happening against a marginalized group, but words are violence, right? That's the next step. Words are not violence. Words are words, right? Words are not violence. And then what's the next step beyond that? Well, we've seen that a lot as well. Many of you may have seen the term or on signs or stated that silence is violence. Silence is violence. So what is violence then now? What is that? It's the same thing with microaggressions. On Psychology Today, they have an article that's the actual title. This goes right along with what we're saying here. The actual title of the article is Microaggressions Really Are Aggressive. Well, that's not what a microaggression was. It doesn't matter. More salt on the wound. You have to pour more salt on the wound. Microaggressions are aggressive. And where will we move from there? Well, microaggressions are hateful. Microaggressions are violence. It's a natural development with these types of words coming out of academia. Now, the way to look at a number of these things, the way these things are, this terminology, these words, these concepts are coming out of academia, is all through a Marxian conflict theory type of a paradigm, a worldview. And that is that everything is based off of an oppressor and a victim. So a microaggression isn't enough to be an oppressor, right? You can't do that. So you have to elevate the idea of that to something much worse. You have to be the oppressor. And same thing with the words of, words are violence. Word is not big enough to be, it doesn't fit the idea of an oppressor enough to just say that words are words. You have to say words are violence. And then if you haven't said anything and you're not doing anything and you're passive with something, well, you still have to be the oppressor. So how do we make you the oppressor? Well, a phrase like silence is violence will fit right into that. So everything is brought through critical social justice, this critical social justice paradigm of conflict theory. And the problem is that as you elevate more and more and more, every word or phrase or whatever it might be into oppression, then what you do is you elevate the status of victimhood as well. And that's a problem because there are victims in the world and they do need help and they do need to be watched over, and they need to have an arm around them, and they need to be loved, they need to be included, they need to belong. But this is going to pervert that entire process. And so as you have a more and more fragile generation or society that is constantly has a radar looking for microaggressions toward them, then we all are elevating and creating a victimhood cycle that is going to continue to grow, which obviously makes more and more oppressors. And so those that are fighting in this sense, monsters, right, would be well to think about Nietzsche's comment where he said, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster, right? If there is a victim and you're trying to get into victimhood culture and create a victimhood culture, what are you becoming in the process? We're seeing this unveiled in the United States today. By the way, that article I cited in Psychology Today, it's found somewhere between the two articles, one called Race Lighting, this is a new discipline, and Singleism. Yes, Singleism, a new victim class that is created on Psychology Today of Singleism. These things are not going to stop. I had a discussion just recently with Ralph Hancock from BYU. He's been at BYU for 32 years, and he was telling me about one of the problems that we have in academia is the continual drilling down into more and more specific disciplines. And I had never thought of this before. I have always looked at critical theory and critical race theory in a way, kind of critical social justice in a way where you have, where it's an academy campus and you have a hydra with several different heads. And what are the different heads? They're all of the different departments, mostly found in the social sciences and humanities. And where we might say a little bit more now in theory, in the theory and the theoretical disciplines. But I had never taken it to the next step and understood that, okay, well, when you cut off a head of the hydra, another one comes up. But what really happens is that naturally, this hydra just continues to grow more and more and more heads, more and more little disciplines where we have people that are going into academia. You have all of these PhDs that need something to talk about. They need something to go into, and they're going to drill down further and further. It's the same idea as intersectionality itself. There are going to be so many groups and so many rules that you have to follow to get to communicate and make things just with all of the different groups. You know, it's just going to continue to break down and dissolve, disintegrate. So as you can tell, I'm not real optimistic about the religion of academia and where that's going. Now, lastly, I want to bring up Jonathan Haidt, right? Jonathan Haidt is the one that originally got me looking into critical race theory, for example, and what was happening on the campuses back in 2012. And he wrote a book along with Greg Lukianoff that came out in 2017 called The Coddling of the American Mind. I highly, highly recommend that you read this. If you are wanting to know what is happening with the younger generations, with Gen Z or iGen and the millennials, and you want to know what is happening here between, you know, the Gen X, for example, and the boomers and compared to what's going on here, especially with Gen X, you need to read that book and understand what has happened. It is a convergence of technology, parenting, and I would say psychology. And we're seeing a real transformation on the campuses first, and then again, it's coming out into culture more broadly. But in the book, I want to bring up just a few points in the book. They bring up Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who is famous for talking about the black swan, right? And the idea of the black swan is, look, you look around in the world and it's all white swans. And then all of a sudden you see a black swan and it changes everything with you. How do you deal with that? In other words, life is very nuanced. It's very complex. It's not just simplified, right, primary answers in your life. And when you live in a nuanced, complex world, you need to be able to deal with black swans. That is something that comes out that is different because it happens all the time. He writes about this in his book called Anti-Fragile and talks about how if we are not careful in society, we're just going to become kind of like kitchen china, right? Where it's just really fragile. You drop it and it breaks into 100 pieces. And that's not a good way to go. In fact, all of psychology shows you the exact opposite. That when someone is fragile with something, they need to go through a cognitive behavior process where they start to move into that. They lean into it. They don't pull away from a microaggression. You actually lean into it, and little by little, you become stronger. It's the same idea as lifting weights, right? If you're weak and you lift something and it's too hard and you can't lift it, well, what can you do? Well, you begin to lift small weights and lean into it a little bit, and then you can lift bigger weights and bigger weights. Our immune system works exactly the same way. When you have a little bit of an infection, your immune system, your body builds up antibodies. That's how the world works. Your mind and your emotions work the exact same way. Jonathan Haidt says in this book, cognitive behavioral therapists offer treatment to trauma patients by bringing them face to face with things they consider to be disturbing. Right? You're going to get microaggressions. You don't try and Clorox the world. Triggering anxiety, he says, is essential to recovery. Safety is good, but safetyism is harmful since it considers safety to be more important than anything else, regardless of how minor the danger is, or regardless of how small the microaggression is. He says safetyism stops young, and again, safetyism is just Cloroxing the world around your kids. Safetyism stops young people from experiencing the challenges required by their minds and causes them to become anxious and fragile. So by helicopter parenting, for example, and making sure your child never experiences failure and making sure they never see any adversity, and going well beyond keeping them safe, but moving into safetyism, you make your child more and more fragile. Lastly, from Jonathan Haidt's book, I want to go into what he says about microaggressions. This is under the section called The Problem with Microaggressions. He says it underlines small acts or beliefs of aggression that people of color and other find themselves on the receiving end of. Since brief acts of aggression are a reality, the term is not useless, but since it includes unpremeditated and unplanned offenses as well, the word aggression might be confusing in this context, and it is. Seeing all such acts in the form of microaggressions might exaggerate the associated pain and boost the resulting conflict. In other words, if you're seeing now everything as a microaggression as an offense to you, a deliberate offense to you, then it's a problem. It's not an aggression. It's not a microaggression. It is a misunderstanding. It is someone being insensitive. He says deliberately aggressive acts and prejudice are completely different since they are not minor in any sense of the word. Therefore, the educational institutions that tell their students about microaggressions teach them to construe other people's actions in a very narrow manner. So imagine going to universities, and which is exactly what happens today, and at the beginning of every class, the professor gets up and says, we want to avoid all the microaggressions. So if you hear something I say or another student says, and they heighten it and heighten it and heighten it, that doesn't mean there shouldn't be some training on being a little bit more sensitive. But if you heighten it constantly, and it's up high, and everybody is, ready to latch on to victimhood every time something is said, then that's a real problem. And that is one of the problems that's happening in the universities across the country. By doing this, he says, these schools might actually motivate their students to adopt emotional reasoning and other categories of distortions. This also causes the students to be prone to more clashes and suspicion. It causes it for all of us. We're constantly now going to be more and more suspicious of each other in what we hear from them if we delve into a transactional social currency of microaggressions. And that's why it's dangerous. He concludes by saying a very important psychological point offered by the universe's wisdom conventions signifies that it is not exterior occurrences that make us afraid. It is how we think about and approach them. In other words, that takes you out of the victimhood mentality. It's up to you. How do you think about them and how do you approach them? Don't put things on other people. Put it on yourself. Anxiety and depression are rising in very disturbing numbers with the youth today. And this is a part of it. It is this fragility that is being developed in all of them through society, through our media, through parenting, through the universities. Based on how we think of the world, we can live in a world that is surrounded always with microaggression. Or we can live in a world where we are sons and daughters of God that see adversity, know that it's there, and work with it, and try to lift others up through charity and the love of Christ. So as the church navigates through what we are witnessing today is a very strong cultural change. Hopefully we don't end up saying it's a cultural revolution, because that's what a lot of people want. But as we move through these cultural changes and these language changes and all that comes out of academia, my recommendation, my opinion, is that we're going to need, as President Nelson says, the Spirit to be with us as much as possible. We're going to need that to distinguish truth. We need to use President Oak's clear thinking in these matters. If not, it's going to be hard to navigate. It's going to be hard to juggle these things.